Well, hello. What do we have on us? This is true. I've been sitting here in the dark for a couple minutes. I didn't turn the music thing on tonight because I think somebody tried to hack my Facebook earlier last week, so I had to change the Facebook password. And then guess what? None of my restreaming worked, so I had to fiddle with that. So I figured if I don't have a full 10 minutes to let it run, I'm not going to do it. So hopefully everybody's having a good evening. We have two on here. I don't know who it may be. If you want to comment, that'd be awesome. We'll see who hops on here tonight. Oh, we got three now. Oh. One moment. Hopefully Pamela can hop on. She just texted me she's having issues. Hopefully nobody else is having any issues. Oh, hey, Ian. How are you? Hey, Rick. So, at least I know two of the five. Between work and home, I probably drink way too much coffee. I've realized that recently, but oh well. Oh well. The clients at work were asking me one day, they're like, something about my caffeine addiction. I was like, I don't have any caffeine addiction. That's just how I stay awake. Oh, good. Pamela's here too, so. Yes, there's never too much coffee, right? That's why I buy it at Sam's Club in the pods. Oh, you know what I shouldn't? Oh, well, is what it is. I noticed my t-shirt is reading backwards. Who cares? But I usually switch that around, but oh well. Hey, Corey. I'm glad it is working, Pamela. Oh, and Diane's in there. Sorry, I missed you, Diane. You kind of like, that was weird. It went Ian's comment and then Rick's comment, and then there's nobody, and then you like just shuffled in there in the middle. Oh, well. So, whew, still trying to get back on a schedule. I don't know. Trying to figure out what I need to do and go where, so, which is weird. I'm buying groceries tonight, not on a Friday night, so it's kind of odd for me, but I don't know. Hell, all hopefully in due time. I've taken no photos lately. I did go out tonight though, but I don't think I got anything, but we'll see. But Sarah and then we'll be out of town next week, so I'll probably go out both nights then. And then tomorrow night I got to finish up class for Paul's photo, which will give me 2 open nights next week. So I'm kind of been sending stuff to our Iowa, but not getting in. So I have no clue what they're looking for at this point. So I guess I just get to send stuff in and see. But I probably sent in not pretty Iowa, just semi-pretty stuff. So who knows? But well, you know what? It is 8 o'clock, so we are going to get to rolling here. So as always, welcome. I almost said Saturday night, but it is not. It is a Tuesday night. So, Ian, the coffee must flow. Yes, it must. If not, I'm kind of lost in the sauce sometimes. So, tonight we'll talk about manual mode. So, I'm not going to get like super in depth into it. I'm just like skimming the surface. So, I got about 30-ish slides, so we'll go through that. I don't have any other comments. Oh, Diane, I recently saw that extroverts need coffee. Introverts, not so much. I love comments. So, yeah, so manual mode. I mean, some people get the shakes and the shivers, when manual mode comes up. And I tell most people advice is you just do it. So, I will pull up my slideshow here. There we are. So, hopefully everyone can see it. So, I mean, anymore with... you know what? Let me try. Oh, they switched all my stuff around. Bear with me here. I don't know why they do things like this. Some things are just like meant to be untouched. So, oh well. Let me see if I can get my full screen back. Sorry. Oh, well, it is what it is. I'm not going to hold us all up here. So, manual mode, right? I mean, we've all heard of it's the little M on your little dial and stuff, and some people really freak out and despise it. And I think the biggest thing you can do is you just have to go out and just do it. play with it, see what happens, but you got to have a very basic understanding of three things: exposure, so shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. If you don't understand those three things and how they relate together, then working in manual is kind of a challenge. And out of all the years I've been teaching people photography and doing lessons, and it always seems like people want to start at the top of the dial and work their way down. Like I always say, well, skip over auto if you really don't need it, and maybe program mode. But get in those semi-automatic modes like shutter priority, which is TV for Canon, S for Nikon, Sony, about everybody else. And then aperture priority, which would be AV and Canon, and then A for Nikon, Sony, and the rest of them. And then AV, TV, and then manual, right? Well, everybody wants to start at manual. Why? Because they read online that that's the only way you can shoot is manual. Yeah, sometimes, not always. So for the most part, it's just one of those things I never touch this stuff. But it's one of those things that I will tell you, I didn't sit down and read a book ever on manual photography, like how to do. I started out in film, and I kind of just, all I did was change the aperture and the shutter speed, and my ISO was stuck because it was film, until that little light meter in the middle was in the middle, and I was happy, and I guess that was supposed to be correct, right? So that's how I learned it. And then playing around. And I tell people I'm a gut instinct photographer. I'll look at a scene, I'll photograph it, and that's where I'm at. And I'll look at the screen, and then I'll debate if I want brighter or darker. And for me, I don't know how I know. I just feel like I need to go so many clicks of the shutter speed to the left, and that's where I go. That's manual for me. I don't sit there and think half stops, quarter stops. I hate all that crap, but that's what a lot of people get worried about. They're like, you have to have the quarters and the light. No. It's just what it is. But so let's get into it. So we will get into, come on. There we are. So as obviously, right? So I got to have a quote. So the context in which a photograph is seen affects the meaning the viewer draws from it. And what I loved about this is kind of like manual mode. You'll see this picture hopefully in a little bit again, I think. But there is a correct exposure, correct? We'll talk about that later. But for what you're wanting the viewer to see, right? So if we go, sometimes we'll talk more about this in a minute about why we use manual and when and all that stuff. But if you think about it, sometimes the scene you're looking at, if you're looking at it, like let's just say landscape, because that's what I'm teaching right now for Paul's photo. We talk about that the landscape can be really, photography can be three things. It can be impressionistic, realistic, and I'm missing one, but or more like abstract. But we can look at a landscape or a photograph we're going to take and photograph it as is. Maybe that's where we want the little ticker to be in the middle on the light meter, all that good stuff. We want to represent, or representational, that's the other one I forgot. We're representing the photo we're seeing as is. But we can, Chris, I'll get to that here in a minute. So then when you're playing with all this, where I lost. Oh, yes. With your photo, you can go in and say, well, I can make it more dramatic by maybe darkening it up, or I can make it more whimsical and light feeling by going brighter. So maybe that's not what I'm seeing in front of me, but I want to portray. So between camera settings and post-processing, I can show you an artistic vision or a realistic vision. And I think when you get into manual mode, that's where the whole world opens up. So Chris just asked, hey, Bernie, Chris says, how do you use manual in a fast-paced setting? So it depends what fast-paced setting is. So to me, sports is fast-paced. But if I'm shooting sports or a wedding, let's use those two. These are kind of the same, really, because you don't know what's going to happen when and where. So for me, if I get into, say, outdoor sports, let's do indoor. That's probably easier at the moment. So if I'm doing indoor sports, I show up 15 or 20 minutes early, and I take some test shots of them throwing basketballs around, whatever, somewhere where they're going to be playing out on the floor. I don't even have to photograph a player. I'll just photograph a basketball on the floor to get my exposure where I want. So it needs to be correct. So I don't want it to be too dark, too bright. So when I work in manual mode, there's those three things we'll talk about here in a minute: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. I always figure out, okay, what am I shooting? Sports. So what's my most important thing? Shutter speed. Well, if I'm shooting basketball, I like to be 800th or 1000th or higher. So I'll set it to 1000th of a second, and that's going to make my image way too dark inside because it's indoors, right? Shutter opens, closes really quickly, we lose light. So I have two other options, which we'll go into this in a little bit later too, but then I have two other options. I can choose aperture or ISO. So for me, it's showing up early to some situations. It's just experience. After a while, you get used to this lighting, or this scenario is very similar to that a year ago, 5 months ago, yesterday, an hour ago. So you kind of have ideas on settings from there. Hopefully that answers without getting, because I could talk about that one all night, but on how I do it. But so let's jump into this kind of details. But some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is probably going to answer Chris's question. So when do I use manual? How do I use manual? When do I use it? So like I said, creatively, you want to be super creative. Like right now, I'm looking at my new Bluetooth speaker. It's all retro looking over here under the light. I can photograph this in a representational way. I have my lamp. I wish I could show you this, but the lamp is lighting up my little retro speaker, right? So I could photograph this in a way, if I use, say, aperture priority or shutter priority, those semi-auto modes where you're doing half the work and the camera's doing half the work, those modes are in your camera to give you a correct exposure, not dark, not bright, correct, or balanced exposure. If I'm trying to photograph something representationally, it's probably going to work. If I want to get creatively, no, it's not going to, because if I want to purposely underexpose it, it's never going to underexpose, because people say, oh, now I'm just going to go, you would go to exposure compensation. And exposure compensation is one of those where, you can make it darker or brighter. If the camera has already, like, let's say I'm photographing something and the camera considers correct exposure or a balanced exposure, what do I want to say? And it's a smidge too dark, well, then I can use exposure compensation and make it a little brighter. That's what I'm doing there. I can't make it 9 stops darker, and from that, it won't work that way, because it's whatever you're doing, it's trying to counteract something within the camera, whether it's shutter speed or aperture, one of those two, shutter speed or aperture, to, depending on the mode you're using, to balance things out. So if you're trying to get super creative, none of those modes are going to work. Auto is definitely not going to work. You can't change anything there. It's just going to give you what it thinks is correct. So if you're going in the creative route, manual is the way to go, because you can control everything: shutter speed, aperture, ISO. Like I just said, complete camera control. You can control everything. If sometimes you go into some modes on your camera, like I don't remember, there was a model in Nikon, if you went to shutter priority mode, it locked out certain features. Things just didn't work. Or there's another brand for a while, I don't remember who it was, but it might have been Canon, that when you were in a certain mode, it just took them out of the menu. You couldn't find it. It wasn't there until you went to manual, and then it opened up the entire menu system. So it's things like that. Or when exposure decisions have to be made. You need it to be too bright for a reason. You need it to be too dark for a reason. Things like that. And if I jump back to the top point of creativity, creativity too is one of those things where you may want a certain aperture to get a certain depth of field. You may want to then have a certain shutter speed to get a certain look. Well, if I'm in aperture priority mode, I control the aperture. Now I got my depth of field where I want it, but camera controls shutter speed. I can't. But I'm like, but I want to slow the shutter speed down and make it brighter. No, it won't. So then you would have to go to ISO. And then if you went to ISO, then you're like, but I want to go higher to make it brighter, because now I'm going to get noise. So you got to balance these three things out. So usually shutter priority, aperture priority, program mode, auto is going to do that for you, balance everything out to where it thinks it needs based off light and all that, and 9,000 other things that the camera can do in a split second. But that's just where that lands. You can't do anything. Now, if we go into manual, that's where the whole world opens up. I can do whatever I want. I can make it stupid dark or stupid bright, and I can do that because now it allows me to do that. So other scenarios, most people tell you to shoot sports on manual. I prefer to shoot it on shutter priority because 9 out of 10 times my camera's going to pick, if I'm in shutter priority, I'm picking, say, 1,000th of a second to stop action and motion. Camera inherently is going to probably pick almost the widest aperture it can go to let in the most light. And then I set my ISO to probably 1600 is where I start. Now I know some people will tell me I'm psycho and I shouldn't say that because but again, I can put 15 of us in a room right now and we can all do it differently and get the same photo. So it don't much matter how you get it. That's why I hate math. Like, show your work. 1 + 1 is 1. Why do I have to show you? 2 + 1 is 3. Why do I have to show you my math, right? If the answer is correct. I don't give a shit how you get there. You got there, right? So you can do any of this, in a million ways. So there are situations where I'll use manual for sports. If I'm definitely using studio lights or flash, I'm manual. My flash is in manual mode because I'm a psycho and I want to control the power in my flash. And then I need to control all the settings as well in my camera. So when I go studio work, like complete flash, I'm in manual because I want to control everything. TTL is great through the lens metering. So it will tell my flash based off my camera settings that I've all set, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, but that thing's not consistent. It will be too bright one time and too dark and maybe a smidge brighter and smidge. It's just not consistent. It still works, but it's knowing what all these different modes are in your camera and all these different modes on a flash or whatever piece of gear you're using and what fits the bill or the situation the best. Fireworks, I'm always on manual because I have to control aperture and ISO and shutter. What else? Crazy lighting conditions, I prefer to go manual. Or I could literally, every photo I've ever taken, I could have used manual. I can get the same photo in aperture and shutter priority mode is manual. Sometimes manual is just more brain power and a lot more work to get to in photograph, right? So the way I look at it is I'm on the road and I can look at a scene and I got 2 paths to take. I can go full manual, or I can go aperture priority, shutter priority. I'll tell you I shot everything tonight on aperture priority because I feel lazy lately. I don't want to have to sit there and think and do all this stuff. Most time in a landscape, I'm worried about aperture because I select my aperture. I have my ISO set to 100 more than likely. Then if I look at them like, wow, the shutter speed's really low, this is going to be blurry. Guess what I do? I go to the truck, I pull out a tripod. Simple as that. Put it on the tripod, click. I can get the same image on manual. It's just how much do I want to work and what's easier. Most of the time, for most people's stuff, aperture priority and shutter priority are going to work just fine. And if you've got questions at always, just give me a holler. So like this photo. This is one that I did at, I almost said White Sands. It is not. It is Great Sand Dunes National Park. I had to be on manual for this. Look at the light. It's nuts. I've got 2 extremes, brights and darks. If I go on to aperture priority or shutter priority, whatever I choose to pick, it's probably going to give me a balanced exposure, but it's probably going to try to take my shadow area and be a lot like brighter. They're not going to be so dark. That's not what I wanted to portray in this image. So it was dramatic light. I got a crazy sky up above. The mountains aren't lit or anything. It's literally nutso lighting. So I choose to go manual because then I can control that a lot more. I can set it and play around with it a little bit more. I can get the image I'm looking to represent. Now, I'm getting my exposures very close within probably, say, I don't know, a quarter of a stop, a half of a stop of light. And where was I going with that? Oh, well, yeah. So I try to get it close, and then most of it is on to post-process. Like my highlights here were a little underexposed, so I brought just the highlights up. So it's like tweaking things. It's like polishing. But again, it's a lot easier to do this for me in manual than it is to go out and try to force the camera to do something it doesn't want to do. Come on. Or this one, the one of my daughter and my niece, right? Low light. I I had to wait just at the perfect timing for my daughter to lean in to start drawing with the chalk so her headlamp would light up in them. If I did shutter priority, aperture priority, or non-manual mode, it wants to give me everything brighter. This image was a little brighter than in real life, but guess what? I used a slight creativity and I just underexposed it just a little bit. So it was just a little bit darker and gave that more of that pop with the light. Could I have done it in aperture priority, shutter priority? Maybe. But when I look at this was a scene that I know I was going to photograph, and I just figured out I know where I need to be and just got instinct and went with it. So this was one of those, Chris, where it's just past experience, knowing working in low light. When a lot of people want to run away from scenarios because we're terrified of them. Now, don't go book a wedding tomorrow just so you can be terrified all afternoon to shoot in manual and then screw everything up. Go out and just say, okay, I'm going to go out to the flower bed today and I'm going to photograph all in manual, and just be like, well, I wonder if I put my shutter speed here, my aperture here, my ISO here, but that little thingy in the middle looks weird. The tick mark on the light meter, which we'll talk about in a moment. It just doesn't say, what? I don't know what it's doing. Click it and you're like, oh, that's really dark. Maybe I don't want that. So then, what do I do from there? So it's just playing around with things. And once you get that feel and you've done it a million times, then it just gets easier every time. But if you never work on it, it will never get easier. So studio light. This is side lit with the softbox of my child, I don't know, probably 2 years ago now. That I cannot get that look of lighting in aperture priority or shutter priority because it usually wants to give me something I don't. Could I probably get there in the end? Yes, but I'd be fighting it a lot harder and a lot more than I care to when I know I can just take care of it quickly in manual mode. So again, I'm in a studio setting or I'm working with Flash, I'm on manual. So there's 3 factors to manual mode. We'll talk about exposure triangle here in a little bit, but so there's 3 factors: shutter speed, aperture, ISO. So a little bit ago, I said I would say there's 5 things you should have an idea, a very basic idea of what it means, and not how they work together, but at least know what they do. And that is shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and then you need to understand the terms underexposed and overexposed. Because I don't care if you go out and watch a video, unless it's the most basic of videos, which I don't feel is out there very much in the world of YouTube, is they will say, okay, they all expect you to understand aperture, shutter speed, ISO, right? Or you may know that, but you may not know what underexposed means or overexposed, and they'll use those terms. It's like me at my new job. We don't even use words. We got so many acronyms: SO, RO, PO, PPO. There could be like 4 or 5 of those in a sentence. And I have no freaking clue when I started there a month ago what any of that meant. Now I do. So it's like having that little decoder ring that you got in the 50s in a cereal box. You can decode this stuff once you know it. But it doesn't mean you need to know, like RO for me or work as residential officer. PO is probation officer. I don't need to understand what the probation officer does or residential officer does, or in the world of photography, if I don't need to understand how shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are going to work together quite yet. But as long as I know what that shutter speed does one thing, and aperture does one thing, and ISO does a thing, and the meaning of underexposed, overexposed, then things are a little easier to piece together. That's where the struggle comes. I think for a lot of people is they just don't quite know where to start, what all that means, and how they work together. That's the key. And it's also taking one step at a time. I've talked about that before. So you can't get overwhelmed. Something new, right? I've been there for a month and a week or so now. The first week was, what did I get myself into, you stupid idiot? Now I'm like, this is a hell of a lot of fun. I like this all the time. Because why? Because I understand it, or I've taken a time. And how did I understand that? I took the time on my downtime to pull out the resident book that every resident gets and learn it and figure out what all these rules are and what they mean and how they're enforced and what all this stuff is. Then I have to learn my side of the job of all this and when we do this and that. Same thing. if I went in every day to work and didn't take time to learn anything, I would never get anywhere. I'd be gone in 2 months probably, right? Because it's frustrating. So if you don't take time to sit down and look at shutter speed, aperture, ISO at its most basic form, it's going to be a challenge. So long rant, sorry. On to the next slide. So shutter speed. So I'm just going to, these are real basic. I'm just going to go through them. I'm not going to get into like lots of things. So, right? Simple slide. The higher the number, the faster the action, or the more you're going to capture, right? So think of shutter speed is it controls action and motion. So if I go 2 seconds exposure, so my shutter, when I go click, stays open for 2 seconds, 1 second, 2 second, it closes. You can see the little runner guy on the right side is blurry, right? That's what's going to happen to your image. If I'm using a really fast shutter speed on the left of 8 thousandths of a second, I should have flipped these around. Well, I should have, but I didn't. Then guess what? That's going to stop action and motion. So when you go to the exposure triangle part, or you're trying to figure out which one of these three do I want to change, this is going to, any change you make is going to affect the other two. Shutter speed change will affect aperture and IS. Well, your shutter speed will be affected by look of what image you're going to get. So it may go darker or brighter. And you're going to say, okay, now what of the other two do I need to control to make it, if it's too bright, make it darker? But then you got to look at it and then that next step and say, okay, when I change, if I choose aperture, what's going to happen? Depending on which way I go, it's going to make a change. Then I have to, so you can see where you can kind of start balancing all this out based off the look you're wanting. Come on. So like this one, night football. Nikon D7000. This is down at Prairie. This was about 800 to 1,000th of a second under the stadium lights. Guaranteed 6400 ISO at minimum. I believe that's where it was. I never pushed that camera above it. Aperture 2.8. How do I know that? Because that's how I shoot about everything under the lights. 6400 ISO. I like 2.8 because I need to let in all the light to come in, that big fat opening in my lens. So then I have to decide shutter speed. Well, if I'm in this situation, this was at probably 1,000th of a second, 800 maybe ish, probably 1,000 ish, I think. Let's just call it 1,000. And it's blurry. That means my shutter speed is not capturing. Well, it's capturing action and motion. It's showing motion, but I don't want motion to be shown. I want it to freeze it. So what do? I move my shutter speed up. Well, guess what happens? It gets darker because I'm letting in less light. So now I got to look at ISO or shutter speed, or sorry, ISO or aperture. I got distracted by a pop-up, sorry. So if I set it to 1,000th of a second and it's too, let's just say it's too dark, I can look at aperture or shutter speed, or sorry, gee, many Chris, I keep on straight. Shutter speeds at 1,000. Sorry, I look at ISO and aperture, right? Well, I know that when I shoot my lens at 2.8, my 70 to 200, I can't make 2.8 any bigger. It will not get any bigger to let any more light in. So I can't brighten my image up with aperture. I've maxed out aperture. I've got shutter speed. I have to have it at 1,000th of a second. That leaves two are complete out of 3. The only way now that I can make this image brighter is ISO. If I'm at 6400 ISO and I don't want to be higher, to me, my hands are tied behind my back. Simple as that. I have to overlook the higher noise that I'm going to get, say, at 12,800 on that camera, I think was the next step. And then how do I get rid of it if I don't want it? Then that's a whole nother story of post-process, right? So it's thinking of those things. So see how they all like interact, and you got to know what kind of goes where. It's like the pieces of the puzzle we've been talking about. Come on. So then if I go to the complete opposite here, like the photo of the tree in the car, this was 30 seconds long. I had to be on manual because if I went, I could probably do this on shutter priority, but I may get too bright the sky might be too bright only because it's really dark and the camera will want to make some changes, but I won't go there. So here I have to be, when I do night stuff, I like to be For like this kind of stuff, streaks and cars between 2 and 30 seconds, depending on what I've got going. ISO always starts at 400. And then my aperture is usually, I've played with anywhere between 2.8 and f8, depends what I want. So again, it's experience of prior situations and where am I going to go and where do I want to start. Now, it's taking test shots. I'm not going to tell you, Chris, that I show up and I look and I know shutter speed, I know aperture, I know ISO. I take one picture, it's perfect, and then I sit there and wait. No, it doesn't work that way. I have to take shots and I miss shots. You know, I'll bump a button and not check it later and realize that I bumped the stupid dial on the camera and I went from 1,000th of a second to 400th of a second for some dumb reason. And I took 10 shots and they're all blurry because the hand's blurry or the basketball's blurry because it was too slow of a shutter speed. It happens. It's going to happen. You're not going to get this set and be done. Come on. Seems so slow. So let's talk about aperture real quick. So when you look at aperture, I mean, think of it in, you know, its opposite. Small number, big opening. What does that equal? Small number, 1.4, really big opening. It's going to let in a shit ton of light, and it's going to give you a really shallow depth of field. Sorry, really blurry background if you're doing a portrait or a macro. If we go to the other extreme, big number of f22, I've got a stupid tiny little opening. Now what happens with that? Two things. I get very little light coming in, so I'm reducing the light with that tiny opening, and then what's happening is I'm getting everything in focus because I got a much larger depth of field. So when you know that, and if I'm in a situation where I'm like, ooh, I need to let in, you know, less light, I'm going to go to aperture. So you go from, I don't know, where's the situation I had in my head? Let me think about it. You're doing a portrait. That's what we'll talk about. So you're doing a portrait, and oh, it's too bright. So you're like, I got my shutter speed where I want it. I got my ISO where I want it. Let's just call the ISO 400. And you like it, and it's just too bright. So you're like, I'm going to take the aperture, because that's the first thing you think of, and I'm going to take that big opening and squeeze it down a little bit and less light. Let in less light, and you're like, boom, you do it, and you're like, wow, the exposure is perfect. It's not too bright, it's not too dark, but my background's not blurry anymore. It's not blurry enough for me. Well, then you're like, oh, duh, it's because I didn't use 1.4. So you open that puppy way back up, and now you're back to square one. It's too bright. So in this situation, we can look at it and say, okay, of the three, if I've got aperture set, do I look at shutter speed or ISO? Either one will work. Let's say I was at 4,000th of a second for shutter speed. I could go up to 8,000ths. That will make it darker because I let in less light as the camera shutter opens and closes. And that might be perfect. Good to go. Or let's say you go to 8,000th of a second and you're like, oh, it's still a little too bright, but your shutter speed is now maxed out on the camera at 8,000th of a second. We can't go any brighter. Well, we definitely don't want to stop the aperture down to let in less light. We can't over here go any higher to let in less light, so that leaves us with ISO. So what happens there? We were at, say, 400. That's pretty sensitive to light. We'll just knock her down to 250 or 200 ISO or 100, right? Now it gets darker because now we're less sensitive to light. That's simple, right? So it's just those things I'm trying to balance out what you want in an image. Now, if you have no problem with your background being more in focus, then you can leave your aperture choice there. So you can control that brightness and darkness with any of those three. So then if you go and get into ISO, which I don't have any fan, well, I do have, oh, actually, let's go here first. So this is a macro shot I did. 2.8, really close as I could get to a flower on a macro lens. I wanted to show this in an abstract way. If I want more of this flower in, I just go to f4. I'll get more flower in focus. If I want the whole dumb thing in focus, they go to f22, and guess what? Now it's all in focus. So it's simple as that. Or this one, I don't want anything to be out of focus. I want everything from the sand in front of me in my foreground all the way out to the infinity in focus. So I use f22 or f16 or f8. and that's what I get. So again, that right, like shutter speed. So that's the basic of basic. Like if you know fast shutter speed stops action and motion, and this long shutter or a number like 2 seconds, that's going to blur things. You're already halfway there. Aperture, you know, hey, if I go tiny opening, more in focus, less light, big opening, less in focus, or sorry, should back up. F22, more in focus, and then you get, you know, less light. And then if you go to the other end, you know, big opening, you're going to get less in focus, and then you're going to get, you know, brighter images. That's simple as that, really. So again, you don't have to have, you know, I could pull, what is it? I bet you I've got what? Like 3 versions of National Geographic's Ultimate Field Guide to Photography books. And I guarantee you there's like 8 pages on every one of those probably, because there is more to it than that. But guess what? At the very basic form, you'll be able to figure something out. You don't need to know all the doohickeys, right? It's not like you have to be a master at something to be able to start doing anything. You just screw up a lot more. And that's fine, because you should learn from your mistakes. I say that a lot these days. Especially with my new job. Kind of choices have consequences. I'm going to get a shirt that says that one too. So ISO. ISO is probably the easiest of all. Just because the lower the number, the better quality image you're going to get. You're going to get less little of those colored spots all over your image, you know, the reds and the greens and the blue crap. But the higher you go, say like 16 and above, 12,800, you're going to get that more chunky look. It's not going to be as sharp looking because you've got that noise, that texture. But just know the higher the number, the more sensitive to light you are. So indoors, I would say in most rooms that I walk into, I start out at 400 ISO just to see what I get. That's where I set my ISO. And then I'll set my aperture where I want it, my shutter speed, and go from there. And if it's still too dark, guess what? I just have to raise my ISO and deal with it. But then if I know I'm outside on a really, really bright sunny day, I don't need to be at 12,800 or 1,600, even 400. I can be at 100. My camera will go me down, I think, like 25 or 50 now. I can go lower. So simple as that. Lower the number, the less sensitive to light. Higher the number, the more sensitivity. So if it's too dark, usually I go to ISO. Usually. I will say my main in manual, I always have controlled shutter speed for a reason and aperture for a reason. And if it's too bright, too dark, those are locked in, so it leaves me with one thing, ISO. So I have to play with my ISO back and forth. Now, I will, if I can go like say from 1,600 to 3,200, so let's say I was at 3,200 ISO and it's a little noisy, I will purposely go to 1,600 and have it be underexposed, just slightly so dark, and I'll correct for it in post-process. So it won't cause me problems because I don't have to deal with the noise. I'd rather deal with slight darkness or slight brightness than noise. I hate noise. So therefore, I don't go there if I don't have to. So now, let's talk about a light meter. Because this is your friend. Like, we're talking about all these things and how we're going to change it and this or so forth. And how do you know what's right or wrong, right? How do I know it's going to be too bright? How do I know it's going to be too dark, right? I probably got a little more in depth in this than I should have, but it is what it is at this point. So obviously you got to know what a light meter is. Well, what the hell is that? Well, it's a little thing inside your camera. It meters light. It measures it. That's all it's doing. It's taking an ambient light and picking if it's going to be, well, I shouldn't say picking. It's telling you based off your settings and the ambient light if it's going to be too dark or too bright. Now, if you dig into light meters, you're going to hear people say, well, there's 2 types of light meters. There's incident and reflective light meters. Yes, that's true. An incident meter measures the light falling onto the subject. So right now, that would be, I'll go and show you something here in a minute before I go there. Then you have reflective. That measures light reflected or bouncing off the subject. So if you're going to take a picture of me right now, if you're on the other side of my computer, the light I have over here there's light coming onto me being reflected off, but there's light coming, to be reflected off over here. So I can measure that in 2 ways, which I'm not going to get too detailed on that. But let me show you the difference. So this is what your light meter looks like. So whether you're metering reflected light or, using light bouncing off or light falling onto the subject, it's going to tell you brighter or darker. So you got to know 0 is proper exposure, correct, supposedly. I don't like that term that there is perfect exposure because I think that's horse hockey. It is what you want it to be in the end. But you need to know that out of a light meter, I don't care if you know what those numbers mean. The farther the left that little tick mark under the 0 is, the darker it's going to be. The farther that little tick mark to the right, the brighter it's going to be. If you get into more manual, in-depth, you'll hear people talk about stops of light. 1 stop of light, 2 stops of light. This is what they're talking about. 0 to 1, 1 stop. 0 to 2, 2 stops. Either way. This is going to be in the viewfinder at the very bottom of your camera, most cameras. Sometimes they're on the side. I don't know. That's usually a bygone era, but it can show up there because I think my old Nikon, I could put it there if I wanted, but we won't go there. So this is the light meter, right? This is just telling you if it's going to be too bright or too dark based off the settings you have chosen. Simple as that. Now, people will say, okay, when I was just talking about incident light, that's light falling onto the subject. So that picture I took there, incident, so the light. This light right here, this is incident light. Light falling onto me. If the camera position, that's reflective light. That's this light bouncing from me to the camera. So when I set my exposure for video on this camera in front of me, same thing, video, stills, whatever. I want it to be too bright, too dark. I have that. I use the camera's light meter inside. I'm on manual, so I set my ISO and my shutter and my aperture, all that. I use that to say if it's going to be too bright, too dark. I will tell me sometimes it's like, it's perfect, and I don't like it. It's too bright, so I purposely make it too dark or brighter. So just know that you'll hear the term incident and reflective in light meters. But what does that mean when it comes to the actual doing? So people say, well, which one's better? Which one's better? How, should I measure for manual, light falling on the subject or, from the camera position, so on and so forth? Well, really, incident metering reads is probably your best option because it reads the intensity of light falling onto the subject. So it's going to provide you better readings on the meter that will create more accurate and consistent colors, tonality, contrast, all that stuff. No matter how much light that stupid cup reflects off of, or a silver thing reflects off of, background color, brightness, whole 9 yards. But there's a problem with this, and I will show you next, because the only way you can do incident metering is to spend more money. So the camera is reflective. That light meter is a reflective light meter. It only reads light off the subject. We don't have an incident built in, so you got to get a handheld light meter. And you click it, and they're start out at like $400 for a good one. Do you need to go to incident? No. You can do everything you will ever need, for the most part, in reflective. For your needs, I would say. I don't know if there's anybody that I know that comes on here on a regular basis that would need one. No questions so far, or did well, there's 10 people still here, so I haven't terrified anybody, so. But I just wanted to throw that up there. If you start digging into it and you'll see things, people say, do I need an incident light meter? I love mine. Ask me how many times I pull it out of the bag in a year. 2, 3, maybe. It's at least under 5. So I usually do it when I do flash. I have it meter my flash, and then I know how bright it is and so on and so forth. That will go to there because that will definitely terrify and send people away. Excuse me. Let's talk correct exposure. So I hate this. Correct exposure. It's horse hockey. Hate it, hate it, hate it. So people say, well, there's a perfect exposure. There's correct exposure in my book. There's no such thing as a perfect exposure. I don't believe that. There's a correct exposure, meaning, overexposed, underexposed. That most people will look at this and say, holy crap, that is so overexposed at the top that is not going to turn out. Or holy crap, that's so dark on the bottom and underexposed, it's nothing's going to come of it. It's horrible. Maybe to the camera, right? This little thing up here, that is incorrect. It's not a correct or proper exposure. But to you, the creative, maybe it is. And I'm going to show you here. So like this one, right? Perfect exposure. This, in my camera, I think I did do manual on this one. It probably was in the middle or very close. It was probably could have been a hair darker than what it actually was. But again, that wouldn't have been proper exposure of the camera because that stupid tick mark wasn't dead center under that 0. Now, come on. Now, if that's what your picture looks like on the back side of your camera, that's incorrect for the most part. I'm assuming you don't want it to be like that. Maybe you do. So to me, I'd be like, oh, no, probably not what I want to see. Doesn't mean that's not what you wanted the viewer to see. So that could be correct exposure to some, but to a majority of people, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't want that. So then if you go into the next world, oh, did I forget one? Yeah, I did. I had one that was way too dark. Oh, well. But again, if it's way too dark, maybe that's how you want it. Maybe not. Don't matter. So let's talk about exposure triangle. I have a feeling that slide's just out of place. Nope. So I've kind of talked about this a little bit already, where we balance things out. So every time you make a change, you know what? I'm going to try something here. I thought I had a virtual whiteboard, but I don't think I do. Well, poops. Oh, well, is what it is. I was going to write some stuff out so you could see it, but it would probably be useless anyway because I'd be writing with a mouse. So I've kind of talked about it a little bit. So just think of the exposure triangle as these 3 things: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. If, like, let's say right now, f8 is proper, is the aperture you've chosen, ISO 400. I'm going to write this down because I'll forget. So if I'm sitting there and my aperture is f8, my ISO is 400, my shutter speed is, let's just call it 250 a second. And my little meter, I'm going to see if this works. It's probably not going to work, but I should have put this up on the screen, but I got busy today. So that way is dark and that way is bright. Okay, so in theory, that little check mark, right, could be like right there. This is not working. Oh, well, thanks, Nikon. I'll blame Nikon. Oh, well.
Okay, I found this on the web for dial chip mark.
No, Siri. Look, Siri.
I don't see a chip mark in your contacts. Who do you?
There we are. Stupid Siri. Okay, let's get back. She doesn't need to be on every device Apple makes. Where was I till she about? Oh, yes, f8 at ISO 400, sorry, at shutter speed of 250th of a second. That might be proper exposure. But if it's a little too dark, we could go, if it's too dark, I could go from 400, maybe up to 800, and that's going to brighten it up enough where I want it. But let's say I want 400 ISO for a second, and I want my shutter speed at 250. That leaves what? One thing, aperture. So what do I do now? If I go higher aperture, right, I'm going to let in less light. It went from f8 to f22 or whatever. It's going to get darker. And I'm not getting what I want. I'm getting more of what I don't want. So I have to take that opening and open it up more. All I'm doing is changing ISO or shutter speed or aperture or 2 of the 3 or 1 of the 3 to get that little tick mark where I want it, or roughly in the center, to get a bright picture. I could go into this a lot more in depth, but I don't want to scare the crap out of people, and I want to try to keep it as simple as possible. But just know that every time you change something, it's going to get brighter or darker, either way. And then you just say, okay, if I change my ISO and I lowered it, it's less sensitive to light. Yeah, it makes sense. It's going to be darker. Well, how do I fix that now? Right? Don't go spaz mode and freak out. It is darker, right? Because you told it to be darker, whether you thought you were going to or not. So you could be like, oh, I can take my aperture and open it up, or I could lower my shutter speed, because the slower the shutter speed, the more light comes in. There's your fix. Maybe you don't want to change shutter speed or your ISO. You're left with aperture. Let's say you're taking a portrait and aperture is your biggest deal. You have plenty of shutter speed to move around and plenty of ISO. You pick one of those. Let's say at this point you don't want to move aperture, you don't want to move ISO. Guess what? You only can move shutter speed. Can't move the other two. You could, but you as a creative have decided not to move those. So if you just look at it, it's just you just got to move these three things around in your head and figure out what order you want them to be in a sense of how much light do I want to come in. Okay, that's what it's all about. Photography is about light. We're like, all these are having light, doing something with light, sensitivity to light, how much light's coming in through the shutter and the aperture. So you can say, hey, I'm going to tell aperture to close down, make it smaller, less light, fixed if it's too bright. Or shutter speed, go faster, let in less light, fixed. Now if it's too dark, shutter speed, go slower, let in more light. Now you got to worry about, well, is it too slow if I'm hand holding it? Nope, that's still good. My subject, shutter speed is good for the subject. It's going to be fast enough. I'm good. Leave it there. Then I can control ISO aperture. So I could go all night on with scenarios, but hopefully this kind of like helped you at least make it like, ooh, not too terribly scary. This is just, I think, the basic of basic where you can kind of get in. So now that we're done with that, if you have any questions, throw them down there. I will answer them. So, let's see. I still have not had time to make slides or my little doohickeys ahead of time like I normally do. I don't know why, but it is what it is. So, let's see. So yes. So manual mode is tonight. So the 25th. Oh, boy, that's an old list. So next week, we will talk about white balance. I put it out on Facebook and like, ooh, I want to talk about white balance. I may throw some other stuff in there too, but so next week I'll just talk about white balance. And then I might talk about the 9th or the following week. Let's just call it the following week because my chart is all screwed up. Just talk about carrying gear, different types of camera bags. I think I've done this before, but just we'll hit it again because there's a lot more newer people on here than when I did the last time. I'm not going to do one the 15th of August because I will be at the Iowa State Fair and I will be taking my child shopping for school clothes in Des Moines. So I'm doing that on my days off. So we won't have anything then. I can't even read my own writing today. Wow. The 29th. Yeah, you know what? I will figure that one out. Boy, I'm real prepared this evening, as you can see. But the one thing is if you have ideas, like I'm kind of struggling with coming up with some different stuff. I want it to be interesting. So if you guys have something, ping me a message on Facebook. I don't care if it's 50 things. And then I've got a list over here, but I don't like any of them. I'd rather do it for you guys. That's what I do it for. So I want you guys to send me stuff. I should do another Q&A. It's going to be a year next month that I started this whole kit and caboodle Yahoo-ness. Maybe in sometime in August, we'll just do another straight up Q&A, like how this whole crazy thing started. So that's all I've got for coming up. And then as always, thank you guys, especially for being so flexible with my new job and being like, yes, we will still show up and listen to you yak and complain and bitch. And give information all night long on Tuesdays. So again, thank you guys for coming as always. You can always catch everything on YouTube if you want. If you want to support the show, you're more than welcome to scan the little QR code up there. That's all I got to say about that. What else? I think that's all I've got. So I'm going to go adult now and get groceries at 9 o'clock at night, hoping that Walmart won't be packed. So again, if you've got ideas, shoot them to me in an email, justin@tedfordphoto.com, or go to Facebook, send them over that way, like in a private message, just so I'll see them, because I don't believe that Facebook always shows me all your guys' comments when you comment on something, because I have two different apps. Sometimes I see them in the Facebook app. Sometimes I see them in the Facebook business app. I don't know. So, but again, as always, and Bernie, I hadn't seen you in a while, and Chris, that was great for you to show up. And as always, Rick and Diane and all the team. So awesome. So hopefully you guys all got a little, maybe it was a little less misty and a little clear, a little more clear. I don't hopefully I solved your problem and now you love it or you're more interested in doing it. Hopefully I didn't confuse you anymore. But so we are going to call it a night. Thank you guys as always, and I will see you all next Tuesday.